Hey folks, it's Chili. Now that both Japan and the Byzantines are confirmed to be coming in the next DLC, that means that there's only one remaining fan favorite Civ that's yet to make it into AOE4. And we all know what it is, say it with me now, the Khmer! Hell yeah, give me those ballista elephants. Just kidding. Of course, I'm talking about the Vikings. We want to see those longships, the Dane axes, the berserkers, and the new expansion's not even out yet, but I still cannot wait. So I went ahead and designed my own version of this Civ. In this video, I'll be diving into how a Viking civilization could work, as well as the real history that inspired my design. It's going to be a good bit of fun, so stick around. If you're curious about other Civ concepts as well, including for the Khmer, I've actually made quite a few, and they're all posted on my website. The link is in the description below. And if you're having a good time and you're finding yourself enjoying this video, I'd really appreciate it if you can give it a like, as it'd really help out the channel. And speaking of channel, if you want to see more videos like this one, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I have a ton more content planned for you guys. Alright, without further ado, let's get right into it, how I designed the Danes in AOE4. In today's world, Vikings have absolutely enthralled the popular imagination. Pun intended. They have taken over by storm, and can be seen in pretty much every nook and cranny of Western pop culture. Bearded, tattooed warriors with big axes and a thirst for battle. The quintessential barbarian trope. But the real history behind these legendary warriors is perhaps far more mundane. Vikings were just people from Scandinavia, regular medieval folk like you can imagine from anywhere else. A far cry from the half-nude and bloodthirsty barbarian image. Rather, they were mostly just farmers with plain medieval clothing, maybe a pig or two, maybe even a little fur hat. Now, there's many competing theories as to why Vikings started doing the thing that they did, raiding and pillaging everyone from England to Sicily and beyond, and the theory that I lean towards most goes something like this. By the 7th century, improvements in agriculture led to a population boom in Scandinavia, and many second sons who couldn't inherit land instead found gainful employment as overseas raiders. After all around them were peaceful, God-fearing Christians who just happened to store all of the treasure in unguarded monasteries. I mean, how could you not raid them? These seafarers would travel far and wide, seeking plunder and booty, and their exploits ranged from serving as mercenaries as far south as the Mediterranean Sea, to exploring what's west of Westeros, sailing for greener pastures. And then greener still, being the first Europeans to make landfall in North America. Fans of AOE2 will be all too familiar with the Vikings, as in that game they were mostly known for their regenerating berserk infantry, as well as their cheap longships. They were the perfect faction for the game's Dark Age vibe. But by the time of the Age of Sail and Enlightenment, Vikings had long grown out of their pagan associations, and so they don't quite make an appearance in AOE3. The closest representative that we have is Sweden, which by the 17th century had become the most dominant power in Scandinavia. It's important to note that while pop culture refers to them as Vikings, Vikings weren't actually a people. Rather, it was a profession. To go on a Viking means to go on a raid. So in this concept, I won't refer to them as Viking, but rather I'll be calling them the Danes.
Danes. Devil's turds.
Now, the Danes were their own historic polity, and I'm choosing to use these guys to represent the Viking faction in AOE4 because they were the most dominant Scandinavian nation throughout most of the Middle Ages. England especially strongly associates Vikings with the Danes, as they suffered quite a few invasions from the Danes that would permanently alter the course of the island's history. This all being said, the Danes were far from the only active Scandinavians during this period. Norwegians, Swedes, Finns, and even Icelandic folk were all engaged in Viking raids, colonizing lands, trading, or serving as Varangian mercenaries. This concept will begin in the year 793 CE, a very important year in Viking history, as it's the year of the raid at the abbey at Lindisfarne. And from the perspective of the monks there, this was a heinous travesty carried out by godless marauders, and their records of the event have done a lot to color our perception of the Vikings to this day. In English tradition, 793 is considered to be the beginning of the Viking era, while 1066 is considered to be the end. Now, if you're a savvy history buff, you might be familiar with that year because it's the year of the famous Battle of Hastings, when William the Conqueror was able to defeat the Saxon army and take over England, setting the stage for the next millennia of English history. But interestingly, this is not why it marks the end of the Viking Age. Instead, there happened to be another battle that took place just a week before Hastings. You see, while William the Conqueror was coming in from the south of England, the legendary Harald Hardrada with the mighty Norwegian host was invading simultaneously from the north, and poor Harold Godwinson and his Saxon army were sandwiched between the two of them. The Saxons ultimately chose to stop the Norwegians first, and thanks to their army's lightning quick march, they were able to catch the Norwegians completely off guard. A single heroic Viking warrior held the crucial choke point at Stamford Bridge and bought just enough time for the Viking army to form a shield wall. But unfortunately, this was not enough, and so Harald Hardrada's legendary saga was ended at the Battle of Stamford Bridge.
Verkat sitja sátr einhverjum saman í Valhöllu á meðan þú herkir hér.
And so the last great Viking invasion was snuffed out. That's why 1066 is considered to be the end of the Viking era. Though Harold Godwinson is mostly known for his defeat at Hastings, all things considered, he did a pretty good job defending in a 1v2 situation here. While the Viking era may be over by 1066, that is not where I choose to end this concept. AOE4 civs go well into the Renaissance time period, which means that we get to see these heathen Vikings transform into quote-unquote civilized Christians. By the time of the Renaissance, the Danes would go on to form the Kalmar Union, an alliance with Norway and Sweden, and become the most dominant power in the North Sea. This concept will end in the year 1658, the year of the Treaty of Roskilde, which saw the defeat of the Kingdom of Denmark-Norway to Sweden, their longtime rival, marking a shift in the balance of power when Denmark was finally dethroned from being the top dog in Scandinavia, and now Sweden becomes the biggest player on the block. You can kind of think of this as transitioning from the AOE4 time period to the AOE3 time period. To reflect this diverse history, the Danes will play very differently in the early game versus the late game. Starting on the Dark Age, the Danes will fully embody the Viking identity. When you play the Danes, you're playing the Vikings. You're gonna do some raiding, you're gonna do some berserking, you're gonna bring glory to Odin as you forge your own epic saga. In fact, the epic saga will be your central mechanic. Accomplish great feats in the early game to secure bonuses that will help you transition into the late game. And by the late game, the Danes will play much more like a standard European Civ. Alright, let's get into the strengths and weaknesses. This faction's all about strong, early aggression and making good use of the powerful Danish melee infantry. At the same time, you're gonna have a very well protected home base, thanks to the Longhouse unique building. And lastly, this faction will have a much faster tempo than other factions thanks to their saga bonuses, which allow them to accelerate their military and economic progression. The saga system can also be a weakness, however, as your opponent can move to counter you and slow you down. Without completing your feats, the Danes are relatively weak compared to other civilizations. Like the Ottomans, the Danes lack economic bonuses, which means that their late game is rather lackluster. And lastly, outside of their infantry, the Danes have a pretty average looking roster. Alright, let's take a look at the civilization's unique traits. The first trait is called Vikingur. Now throughout this concept, I'll never make direct reference to the Vikings, so this is the closest I'll get to it. As mentioned before, the Danes are all about early aggression. They'll have a unique unit known as the Raider that's available in the Dark Age. These guys are purpose built for sieging down structures and perfect for early game shenanigans. Additionally, they have a men-at-arms replacement, the Huskarl, which will also be available early in the Feudal Age. These bonuses all reinforce the Danish playstyle being centered around early game infantry. Their next trait is their influence mechanic, which I'm calling the ring fort. Historically, Norse settlements were laid out in a distinct ring fort formation where a bunch of longhouses formed up in a ring shape, guarded by wooden palisades, making it incredibly defensible. I took a bit of inspiration from this and give the Danes the unique longhouse structure, which replaces the standard house. Compared to a normal house, longhouses are a bit more expensive but provide housing and can garrison villagers, and they're tankier. Now what's really interesting though is that longhouses will emit an influence zone with a radius of 2. If another longhouse is placed within this zone, a wooden stockade is formed between them, which prevents enemy units from passing between the longhouses. This means that the Danes will have an easy way to form partial walls to defend their base from enemy raids, all while their own infantry are out there doing their own raiding. The downside, however, is that the Danes, just like the Rus, will not be able to construct stone walls, at least not normally. You can also think of this as a way to throw a bone for players coming from AOE2 who are used to constructing walls made of houses around their base. The last Danish trait is the most important one. It's none other than the epic saga. Forge a legend worthy of the Skalds. This is the trait that makes this faction play like none other. From the beginning of the game, you'll get access to 8 feats, and you can think of these as quests to complete. When you complete a feat, you can choose to receive an associated reward, which could be a one-time boost or a passive upgrade, and we'll get into exactly what those bonuses are shortly. It's important to note here that though you can complete all 8 feats, you can only choose to accept 4 of the rewards in total, so as a player you have to be intentional on how you want to write your own saga. Which bonuses do you want to prioritize? The feats are typically very easy to accomplish and are primarily meant to define your early game encounters. While aggression is encouraged, it's not essential, and some feats are more economic or defensive in nature. This system follows the precedent set by the Ottoman Vizier point system, where instead of researching technologies, the Ottomans get access to Vizier bonuses. What's even cooler about the saga system though is how it adds to the strategic depth. Not only does it incentivize you as a player to go for these feats, but it also gives your opponent counterplay options. If they see you obviously going for a particular feat, they can work to deny that from happening. At the same time, while feats give a huge tempo advantage to the Danish player, they're also relatively weak compared to the bonuses that other civs can research. If the Danish player can accomplish their feats early, then they do gain a huge tempo advantage, but if their opponent can successfully slow them down, then the rewards become less and less impactful later into the game. I get the sense that this might be a little bit confusing, so let's go ahead and get into each feat and the reward so you guys can see exactly how it would work. The first feat is called Desecration. It's very simple. Set an enemy structure on fire or destroy it. You can think of this working as very similar to the Mongol pillage ability, and if your opponent deletes their structure but you're still able to get a hit off, it still counts. The reward for doing this is a one-time deposit of 400 gold. The historical inspiration for this one is pretty obvious. It represents the raid at Lindisfarne and other monasteries, and this synergizes really well with the early raider that the Danes have access to, and it's great for offsetting the costs of early technologies or a fast age up. The next feat is called Turf Roofs. All you have to do for this one is construct 2 longhouses that gain the ring fort bonus. And if you do so, your longhouses will now gain a turf roof, which slowly grows and matures over time. This also provides an aura that boosts the food gathering rate of nearby villagers. The more mature the turf gets, the bigger the buff, up to a maximum of 20%. This is one of the few economic bonuses that the Danes will have access to, and obviously boosting food production synergizes very well with the Danes' reliance on food-heavy infantry. But since it takes time for the turf to mature, this bonus is better for a mid-game timing attack rather than for early-game aggression. Now historically, turf roofs or sod roofs are a unique architectural element in Scandinavian houses. It's something that's been done in the region since prehistory, and many surviving examples still stand today, especially in Iceland. The turf helps both insulate heat and it protects the house from rainwater. And I think aesthetically it would just look really cool to see Danish bases with these beautiful turf roof houses. It's very much inspired from the Swedish torps that we see in AOE3. Their next feat is called Ski Soldiers. For this one, you just have to float 500 wood in your resource bank. The reward is that all of your infantry will now be able to move 25% faster when out of combat. And as you can imagine, this would really help facilitate a raiding playstyle. The feat's very easy to do, though perhaps a little bit harder in the early game when floating 500 wood might slow you down significantly. So I see this kind of feat being most accessible when you're going for an early 2TC into feudal aggression kind of play, where you have to save up at least 400 wood for the TC anyways. Historically, skis were used for troop transport throughout the Scandinavian region and in other northern European regions as well, and our first records of this came as early as the 12th century. And since the properties of snow have not changed over the centuries, skis continue to be a reliable way to move infantry quickly to this day. And I know most of the maps aren't snowy, but I think this is still a great historical call out. So you'll just have to use your imagination when you unlock ski soldiers on dry Arabia. Next up is Thralls. Thralls historically were Viking slaves and servants, and it might be a little bit too un-PC for AOE4, as there's been scant references to slaves in the game so far. The only one I can think of is the Abbasid Ghulam. Ghulams were technically slave soldiers. But Thralls are such a key aspect of the Viking identity, and I also think it makes a lot of sense to acknowledge that the Vikings weren't just pillaging for fun, they were actually massive slavers. So to accomplish this feat, you have to just kill one enemy villager. And the bonus that you'll receive is that from now on, every single time you kill another one of your opponent's economic units or destroy one of their economic structures, you'll get a small reward of gold and wood. This is very similar to the Mongol pillage bonus. This is the only other economic bonus that the Danes can access. It's a way to thematically incentivize economic raiding, and you can think of it as kind of like when you're quote-unquote killing these villagers, you're actually capturing them. The next feat is called Blood Axe. It's a reference to Eric Bloodaxe, the legendary king of Northumbria, and honestly, I thought the dude just had such a cool Viking sounding name that I think it deserves a reference. That being said, I don't feel too strongly about the name here. What I do feel strongly about is the bonus. All of your melee infantry can now slowly regenerate health when out of combat. This is a reference to the Berserk units from AoE 2, and it also means that the Danish infantry raiding style has a bit more staying power, similar to French Royal Knights. The next feat is called Colonization. All you have to do for this one is build 12 structures, so it plays very similarly to the Abbasid Golden Age mechanic. The reward for this one is that your infantry can now build outposts and military production structures, your barracks, stables, archery ranges, and siege workshops. Fans of Age of Mythology will find this very familiar, as the Norse infantry in that game had the ability to build all their structures. And the idea behind this is that it'll give the Danes an easy way to build forward bases as well as backdoor bases, and it facilitates the travel of their units, as Danes are mostly focused on infantry, which are relatively slow in this game. Of course, the historical reference here is the various Norse colonies that were set up everywhere they traveled, Iceland and Greenland being some of the most prominent ones. And this feeds into the next feat called Exploration. This is a reference to how in addition to raiding, colonizing, and enslaving, the Vikings were also great explorers. Gee, now I think about it, they're kind of like a mini version of the rest of Western Europe in the early modern age, huh? Most famously, Leif Erikson
It's Leif Erikson Day! Hinga-dinga-durgan!
explored the region known as Vinland, which is in modern-day Newfoundland in Canada, and there him and his settlers fought with the local tribes that they called Skraelings. In-game, if you manage to explore 90% of the map, and based on the post-game screen I know that this can be tracked, you unlock the ability to gain 4 free villagers that spawn immediately at your town center. As you can imagine, if you were to go for say 2 early scouts, you could explore the map very quickly, and this could be a big economic tempo advantage. We've now finally reached the last feat. It's called New Faith, and it's a reference to the Christianization of Scandinavia. During the early Viking era, Scandinavians believed in the Norse religions, your Odin, Thor, Loki, and the like. But the more the Vikings traveled and pillaged and traded, the more they came into contact with Christianity. Interestingly, we have archaeological evidence of this transition. As the Norse believed in a pantheon of gods, Christ essentially fit as another god within their pantheon. This 10th century mold was used for casting amulets, and you can see both the Christian cross as well as Thor's hammer depicted here, meaning that for the time, the two religions actually coexisted side by side in Norse culture. But as we get into the 11th century and beyond, more and more Scandinavians would drop the Nordic gods and go fully into Christianity. So for this feat, you just have to hold on to any sacred site for at least 1 minute. Doing so will make the cost of aging up to Imperial 40% cheaper. You also get a second bonus here, which is to finally be able to build stone walls. Now this could be a feat that you focus your whole strategy on. Have a large army defend your monk as they capture and hold a sacred site, and it could facilitate a very fast and defensive Imperial age. Likewise, however, the move is very telegraphed, so your opponent has many options when it comes to stopping you. Okay, so that's the Saga system. I originally came up with this when I was thinking through how a Viking faction should play in AOE4. I mean, obviously you'd want to have infantry-based raiders, but how do you make them play in a way that doesn't just copy the Mongol pillage mechanic? And I also wanted to account for the fact that the Danes weren't uncivilized Vikings throughout the entirety of the Middle Ages. In fact, pretty quickly they transitioned to become a relatively standard European state. And so I feel like the Saga system was a perfect fit. Players will be motivated to move out and raid their opponents early, and then use their Saga bonuses to transition into a more standard Civ late game. And I felt like having what basically amounts to quests in the game kind of reminded me of Skyrim, which is a good kind of thematic tie-in. I'm really happy with the Saga idea, and if the devs are listening at all, I really hope they take inspiration from this Saga system. Alright, with that all out of the way, let's now move on to the units. The barracks is the most interesting place to start, so we'll start there. Like the English, the Danes won't be able to build spearmen in the Dark Age and will instead have access to the Raider unique unit. The Raider is a fast-moving light infantry unit. They're squishy, but they do very high damage using the dreaded two-handed bearded axe. Now keep in mind that because they deal a lot of damage, they can also function as a soft counter to armored units in the early game. They also have a special passive that gives them additional attack speed with each successive attack, up to a maximum of 40%. So in a way, you can think of them as kind of like melee stealthy. The longer they're fighting, the stronger they become. This attack speed bonus also applies when they're attacking structures, which, when combined with their higher siege damage, makes these guys really good at sieging down buildings, especially if they can do so without interruption. In the Feudal Age, you can upgrade your raiders with the Berserker game technology. I actually originally wanted to call these guys Berserkers, but I felt like it'd be a little weird to have Danish Berserkers fighting alongside Knights and Hand Cannoneers in the Imperial Age. I felt like Raider was a slightly less ridiculous sounding name that could still fulfill the same identity. Now, Berserker gang refers to a trance-like state of fury that some Viking warriors were reported to have engaged in. Berserkers were known to lose control of themselves, no longer feeling pain, and fight with an inhuman strength. Some researchers suggest that this may have been induced through an ingestion of hallucinogenic mushrooms or some other kind of drug. The movie The Northman does a great dramatic portrayal of the Ulfhednar, a famous elite berserker group that wore wolf pelts for intimidation. In-game, Berserker Gang will be an ability for your raider units. When it's activated, your raiders will howl in a fit of rage and begin to move much faster, and for that brief period, they cannot go below 1 health. This gives an otherwise very squishy unit a lot more survivability, and you definitely don't want to engage with a group of raiders going berserk. Oh god, I just realized I just redesigned Tryndamere in this game. For the spearmen, the Danes are going to have a pretty standard spearman. The only difference is that instead of being available in the Dark Age, they're available in the Feudal Age. This works exactly like the English spearmen. Their last barracks unit is called the Huskarl. This unit replaces the man-at-arms for the Danes, and they're slightly cheaper, and they also deal bonus damage to ranged units. So they're essentially an anti-range specialist. This takes a lot of inspiration from the Huskarls in Age of Mythology, which were also an anti-ranged infantry unit. There's sort of a version of the Huskarl already represented in game in the form of the English man-at-arms, but I feel like that doesn't really count. Huskarls are so cool that they deserve to have their own proper representation. In the Castle Age, you can upgrade the Huskarls with a unique upgrade called the Shield Wall. This is a reference to the famous shield walls deployed by Norse troops all over the place, like Hardrada's troops at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. What this means in game is that the Huskarls will emit an aura that provides +2 range armor to all nearby infantry. This is a great way to make up for the squishiness of your spearmen and your raiders, and it's quite similar to the camel support technology available to the Abbasids. Next, let's take a look at the stables. There's not too much going on here. The Danes will have access to the standard horseman, as well as the standard knight in the Castle Age. Historically, once the Scandinavians Christianized, their military started to look very similar to any other Christian nation. Heavy lancer cavalry in the form of knights, great helms, chainmail, heraldry, all that good stuff. You could hardly tell that their forefathers used to worship Odin. Moving on to the archer range, the Danes will have access to the standard roster of range units, the archer, the crossbowman, and the hand cannoneer. Nothing particularly noteworthy here, but in the Imperial Age, depending on the landmark that you choose, the Danes will have access to the mounted crossbowman unique unit. Mounted crossbows were common throughout medieval Europe, but were particularly prominent in Scandinavia. I'm not really sure why though, so let me know in the comments if you have a better idea. Mounted crossbowmen deal a ton of damage, and they're a great late game option against armor, as they can move while they're reloading, though if they want to shoot, they have to stand still. Lastly, we'll take a look at the Danes' Siege Workshop. They've got a pretty straightforward standard roster of siege engines. The one bonus that I'll add here is the Kulverin, which gives the Danes a better late game option against mangonels, as Danish cavalry is rather lackluster and they're also very infantry reliant. Alright, that covers all the units. As you can see, the Danes heavily lean towards their infantry, with a lot of early game bonuses that give them the edge, but the rest of the roster is pretty average. Finally, let's take a look at the landmarks. In the Feudal Age, the Danes will have access to the Runestone ship and the Trelleborg hill fort. Let's take a look at the Runestone ship first. Historically, runestones were placed all over Scandinavia and were typically inscribed with the great feats of past warriors. Runestones were also found placed around great burial mounds formed in the shape of a ship. Deceased Viking rulers would be buried with their ships in a great barrow, and stones would be placed around them afterwards to mark their location. The largest of these is found in Jelling, erected by the King Harald Bluetooth. Yes, that is the namesake of the Bluetooth that our phones use today. In game, anytime a non-siege military unit of yours is killed, they will automatically be queued up and retrained here for free, though at a very slow rate. You can also manually cancel any units in the queue if you want to prioritize the stronger units. Thematically, I took a lot of inspiration from Norse mythology here. Viking warriors that fell in battle would be given a hero's welcome in the halls of Valhalla, where they would await the coming of Ragnarok, the final battle of the gods, whereupon they would rise to fight once again as the Einherjar. This landmark is therefore designed to encourage the Danish player to lean in on the risk and reward playstyle of the early game. It's basically telling you can raid and you can raid hard. It's okay if your units die, because when they die, they'll die for Odin and they'll return to fight once more. It's a bit of a fantasy mechanic here, but I think the thematics are top notch and will enable some very interesting plays from Danish players. For the Trelleborg Hill Fort, this one's designed for much more passive economic play. It functions as an outpost very similar to the Kremlin, and it can shoot arrows at nearby enemies. It also provides the ring fort bonus, this time with a range of 3 instead of 2, meaning that you can have an even longer wooden stockade with your longhouses. Additionally, all longhouses built within the same contiguous ring fort zone gain a boost in health. So this is a great defensive landmark, perfect for locking down an area, perhaps as you try to go for a second TC behind it. Historically, hill forts and ring forts, they were both basically the same thing, were a common fixture of Norse society and sprung up all over Scandinavia. The ring fort of Trelleborg isn't necessarily the most notable, but it's just the best preserved one that we have to this day. Kind of like how Himeji Castle is not necessarily an important castle in Japan, it's just the best preserved one that we have. So in this case, I'm really not married to the name. Moving into the Castle Age, the Danes have the Uppsala Temple and the Great Hall. The Uppsala Temple is a legendary pagan temple built for the worship of the Old Norse gods. It's not standing today, but we do have some artists' renditions of what it might have looked like back then, and I think it'd be super cool if aesthetically it could take inspiration from the designs of the stave churches, which beautifully blend Christian and Norse architectural styles. In-game, this pagan temple can research improved versions of the Saga bonuses that you've already selected. So for instance, your ski soldiers might go from a 25% movement speed increase to a 35% movement speed increase. Additionally, building the Uppsala Temple allows you to select a 5th Saga bonus. This is a great landmark with a lot of flexibility, especially useful if you've already accomplished a bunch of feats in the feudal age. The Great Hall is a swords to plowshares type of landmark. It generates tickets similar to the Golden Gate that allow you to settle or draft. Basically, you spend a ticket, select a unit, and if it's a villager, they'll become a military unit, and if it's a military unit, they'll transform into a villager. This ability takes a lot of inspiration from the Ragnarok god power in Age of Mythology, where upon invoking the god power, all of your villagers get transformed into powerful heroes, allowing for big late game all-in. That's essentially the idea with this landmark as well. You can sacrifice your economy for a big military push, or you can transform your early game military into economic tempo. Historically, there was no one great hall, so this is a bit of a made-up building, but I wanted to make a reference to the massive mead halls where Jarls throw feasts and the warriors would gather. It's a sight that we commonly see in popular depictions of Vikings in media. Alright, next let's take a look at the Imperial Age. By the Imperial Age, the Danes have fully Christianized, and they've become one of the leading powers in Northern Europe. They'll have access to the Uraniborg Observatory and the Krogan. The Uraniborg Observatory is the famous observatory of Tycho Brahe. If you aren't familiar with Tycho Brahe, then get familiar, because this dude was one of the most important astronomers in history. The work he did at this observatory essentially laid the foundations for the scientific revolution in Europe. Needless to say, we owe a lot to this man and his observatory. Anyways, the in-game observatory will reduce all research costs in nearby buildings, so make sure you set up your blacksmith and your university nearby. You also get a special active, we can call it Stargaze or something, but it reveals the whole map for a brief period of time, including stealth units. The other landmark, the Krogan, is the original name for the fortress that would become Castle Kronborg. It's one of the most imposing castles in Denmark, and it still stands to this day. It's actually a little bit weird, but I think the Holy Roman Empire Wonder is also Castle Kronborg, so I really hope that they'll change that around. Historically, this castle was how the Danes enforced the Sound Dues. Basically, any ships that passed by the strait near Helsingborg, which is near Copenhagen, would have to pay up or risk dire consequences. These dues made the Danes very rich, and it also helped the castle become very beautiful. So beautiful, in fact, that it became the setting for Shakespeare's Hamlet, though in the play it was known as Castle Elsinore, an English transliteration of Helsingborg. This landmark will function as a keep in-game, and taking inspiration from the Sound Dues, it will emit a debuff that slows all enemy units in its range. This makes it very difficult for opponents to engage it directly, as Danish infantry will be able to take advantage of the slower enemy targets and rip them apart. As a second bonus, it also unlocks the ability for the Danes to train mounted crossbowmen. Lastly, we're going to talk about the Wonder. I'm going to go with the Borgund Stave Church here. It was built in the 13th century and is one of the best surviving examples of a stave church that still stands to this day. I think it's absolutely gorgeous, and it's such a unique piece of architecture, and it just so effectively evokes the Norse heritage of the region. And it was also the Wonder featured for the Vikings in AOE4. Alright, I think I covered all of it. That concludes my Danish civilization concept. You might have noticed I didn't talk about longships at all, and that's because I don't think water is in a good place right now in AOE4. I don't play it, and I'm not a fan, and I don't know enough to make my own concept for it. And besides, every civilization in the game needs to be able to stand on its own without water, as the majority of the maps are land-only maps. Of course, if the Danes got added, I'd fully expect to see longships, Drakkar, and the like, but I don't have much to say beyond that. I would love to hear your ideas though. What do you think about my concept for the Danes? Do you agree with what I added? What did I miss that you'd want to see included? Let me know in the comments below. And again, if you like this content, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. I have a lot more stuff coming along the way. Alright, that's all for me for now. Stay frosty, guys. Stay chilly.